The year was 1943. Across the vast reaches of the Pacific, the fires of war burned without mercy. From the jungles of Guadalcanal to the coral sands of Tarawa, the sons of Nippon met the inexorable advance of American might. The rising sun, once ascendant across Asia's horizon, had begun to dim beneath clouds of smoke and iron. For the men of the Imperial Japanese Army, surrender was a word unspoken, a shame thought worse than death. Yet in the cruel mathematics of war, fate shows no favoritism. Many who had fought to their last cartridge now found themselves not among the dead, but among the captured. They were the first wave, emaciated, sun-blackened, and hollow-eyed from fever and hunger. Pulled from foxholes, pried from caves, or fished from shattered rafts adrift at sea, they were enemies no longer soldiers, but prisoners of the United States of America. Cameras seldom turned toward them in those days. The very image of Japanese surrender was one the Empire sought to hide, and one America, in its triumph, viewed with wary curiosity. Here were men once sworn to die before yielding, now standing silent beneath foreign skies. Their journey began not in chains, but in silence. Under armed guard, they were led down jungle trails and loaded aboard Navy transports. Each man was numbered, stripped of insignia, his name recorded in the ledger of war. Their swords, their keepsakes, their flags, stitched by mothers' hands, all were taken away, sealed in crates marked enemy property. The voyage eastward was long. The Pacific rolled beneath them like a grave unending, and above deck the scent of salt mingled with disinfectant. The prisoners spoke little. Some watched the sea with blank eyes, others prayed softly into their sleeves. The Marines who guarded them, many fresh from battle, looked on with the hard stillness of men who had seen too much. When the ships reached Pearl Harbor, the prisoners glimpsed the wreckage still resting in the shallows, twisted hulls and silent guns, monuments to the morning when their nation had struck first. Few spoke. The irony hung heavier than the air. From there, the journey continued to the American mainland. Trains carried them across open plains, their faces pressed to the glass as miles of unfamiliar country passed by. Wheat fields, red barns, children waving from crossings, unaware of the men behind the bars. For the first time, they saw the heartland of the enemy, vast, peaceful, untouched by war's destruction. They arrived at camps built in the wide spaces of the American West. Texas, Colorado, Idaho, rows of barracks stretched beneath watchtowers, surrounded by wire and wind. The camps were clean, the rules strict. They were not death camps nor gulags, but places of containment built with the efficiency of a nation at war, yet tempered by the Geneva Convention. Each man was issued a uniform marked PW. They were given cots, blankets, soap, and work details. Food was plain but plentiful. For men who had starved on Pacific islands, the abundance was bewildering. Some suspected trickery, others divine irony. Life within the wire took on a rhythm. Reveille, roll call, labor, rations. The Americans watched them not as monsters, but as curiosities of a fallen empire. Doctors treated malaria. Chaplains spoke of forgiveness, though few words found purchase through the wall of language and pride. It was in these camps, far from the jungles and the emperor's gaze, that the first cracks in the myth of the unyielding Japanese warrior began to appear. Hunger gave way to habit. Fear softened into fatigue, and slowly the men who had once seen themselves as tools of empire began to awaken to the simple fact of being human again. In time, they would learn new routines, baseball games organized by guards, classes taught by American officers, even lessons in English. But the moment that captured history, the moment that would echo through every camp and every memory thereafter, began with something far smaller: a pack of cigarettes, American cigarettes. They came as part of the weekly issue, along with rations of bread, canned meat, and coffee. The Red Cross had approved them. To the Americans, it was nothing, a commonplace comfort in a soldier's day. But to the men of Japan, who had smoked only the harsh, dark tobaccos of home, it was a curiosity wrapped in white paper and silver foil. They stared at them, uncertain. Some refused at first, wary of deception, of poison, of shame. Others held them as relics of the enemy, objects of another world. But when one man finally struck a match and drew the first puff, the camp fell briefly silent. The smoke was sweet, smooth, strange. It was like nothing they had known. In that thin blue haze rose something invisible, a crossing of worlds, an admission of defeat, and an awakening to shared humanity. For a fleeting moment, beneath the same sky that had witnessed their battles, men who had once sworn to destroy one another were bound by a common craving, a quiet exhale of understanding. They were not ready. None of them were. But history had already begun to turn. By the autumn of 1943, the camps of the American interior had settled into a strange and steady heartbeat. Beyond the wire, tractors hummed through endless rows of corn and cotton. Within, the men of the Imperial Army rose each morning to the whistle of reveille, their breath visible in the cold air of dawn. They lined up in columns of 4, their khaki replaced by denim, their swords replaced by shovels. Each name was checked against the roll meticulously, mechanically. The guards spoke little. The prisoners bowed stiffly, a remnant of the discipline that had once bound them to an emperor across the sea. Work crews marched out beneath the watchtowers. Some dug irrigation ditches for nearby farms, others stacked timber or harvested sugar beets under contract to local growers. Payment came in coupons redeemable at the camp canteen, worth little, but sufficient for small luxuries: writing paper, candy, and the cigarettes that had so unsettled them when first issued. The Americans observed with quiet surprise the efficiency with which the prisoners approached their labor. To the Japanese, work was not humiliation, but order, a pattern that steadied the mind against the ache of captivity. Each task was performed with precision tools aligned, buckets washed, uniforms brushed free of dust before evening roll call. Meals were served in the mess halls built from prefabricated lumber. The scent of boiled potatoes and coffee drifted through open doors. At first the prisoners could scarcely tolerate the foreign taste, the sweetness of bread, the grease of tinned meat, but hunger conquered pride. Within weeks they consumed everything placed before them. Some even grew rounder in the face, a quiet testament to the abundance of their captors. The Geneva Convention dictated fair treatment, and the War Department, anxious to contrast its humanity with that of the Japanese camps in the Philippines, enforced the rules scrupulously. There was discipline, yes, but also recreation, education, and a kind of paternal curiosity from the officers in charge. On Sundays, those who wished could attend Protestant services conducted in simplified English, though few understood the words. Others took solace in the routine of calligraphy, the brush tracing kanji across scavenged scrap paper. They wrote poems of home of mountains, of cherry blossoms, of mothers whose faces blurred with distance. The Americans encouraged such expression, seeing in it a softening of the enemy's spirit. They organized English lessons under the Red Cross's guidance. "Peace through understanding," the pamphlets declared. Yet for many prisoners, the lessons were less about language than survival. To learn the tongue of the victor was to glimpse the world beyond the wire, a world that had, through the radio and the newspaper, begun to reveal Japan's slow retreat. Every camp had its leader, a senior non-commissioned officer who maintained order among his men. Beneath the surface of calm ran the undercurrent of shame. Captivity was dishonor. Some still whispered the words, "Gyokusai," to die like a shattered jewel. There were suicides, quiet and deliberate, performed with the precision of ritual. Others chose silence, refusing to speak for weeks. But the rhythm of the camp, relentless in its sameness, wore down resistance. Winter came to the plains. Snow gathered against the fences, muffling the world in white. The Japanese huddled around potbelly stoves, learning to mend their own clothing and to carve small toys from pine wood. For the first time in years, they experienced something like rest. No shells, no alarms, only the monotony of waiting. The guards, mostly young men from the Midwest, found themselves growing curious. They had been told their prisoners were fanatics, beyond reason, yet here were men who bowed politely, who built snow lanterns in the yard, who laughed softly, awkwardly, at the antics of camp dogs. Humanity, so long buried beneath propaganda, began to surface on both sides of the fence. It was during this winter that the cigarette became more than a luxury. It became a ritual. Each evening after work, men gathered outside the barracks to smoke. The act itself, a match struck, a paper tube glowing in the dusk, became a moment of communion. The smoke curled upward, mingling with the frozen breath of hundreds. They passed cigarettes from hand to hand, shared drags, compared the brands. Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield. Some preferred the mildness of one, others the strength of another. To the Americans it was nothing remarkable. To the Japanese it was a window into the rhythm of an alien civilization. Photographs from the period few but surviving show lines of men seated on makeshift benches, eyes half-closed in satisfaction, the white smoke drifting above their dark caps. The captions read simply, "Enemy prisoners at ease, Idaho, 1944. But the faces tell more than the words. There is fatigue, yes, but also a dawning recognition of shared vice and shared relief. The Red Cross inspectors noted the psychological transformation. "Prisoners appear increasingly at peace," one report read. "Contact with guards courteous, discipline maintained, morale stable." They could not record, however, the inner shift, the quiet surrender not of arms, but of hatred. By spring, the camps bloomed again. Baseball diamonds were marked on open fields. Teams of Japanese prisoners played against American guards, their laughter echoing across the fences. The game, born in America and beloved in Japan before the war, bridged a cultural gulf that no treaty could yet cross. After each match, the players smoked together in the fading light, the cigarettes burning down to glowing embers in the dust. Rumors filtered in from the outside world. The Allies were advancing in the Pacific. Saipan had fallen, then Guam, then the Philippines once more. Some prisoners wept in silence, others stared into the distance as though trying to measure the ocean by memory. The Americans did not taunt them. The war had grown too vast, too wearying for mockery. In the canteen, supply trucks brought crates marked "Tobacco, U.S. Army." The cigarettes were distributed by count one pack per man per week. The ritual continued. Smoke became language, a kind of punctuation to the monotony. The act of lighting, of offering, of exhaling. These small gestures rebuilt the concept of trust molecule by molecule. The camp commandant, a colonel of the old school, remarked to a visiting reporter, "They were not ready for defeat, but they are learning what survival means." His words never reached the newsreel theaters, but they captured a truth that history would later confirm. Captivity, for all its hardship, had begun to civilize both captor and captive. By the summer of 1944, the war that had once seemed endless began to bend toward its conclusion. In the Pacific, American fleets advanced from atoll to atoll, each victory measured in blood and miles. From their camps behind the barbed wire, the Japanese prisoners watched the sky for the contrails of bombers that marked the power of an empire they could no longer resist. The newspapers came weekly, printed in English, their headlines shouted across the mess halls by interpreters: "Saipan falls to U.S. forces," "Empire shocked," then "Philippines retaken," then "Tokyo bombed." Each headline was a blow. The men gathered in tight circles, whispering through the foreign syllables, translating loss into silence. Some folded the papers carefully, as though to contain the pain between their creases. The American guards did not gloat. They had come to know the prisoners as laborers, as chess partners, as fellow men. When the news of each island reached the camp, a hush settled over both sides. For the Americans, it meant progress. For the prisoners, the slow unmaking of the world they had left behind. In one camp, the colonel allowed a small shortwave radio to be played in the recreation hall during permitted hours. The prisoners listened to Tokyo Rose broadcasts that drifted faintly across the static, half mocking, half melancholy. Between the swing music and the propaganda, some caught familiar names: cities, regiments, provinces. Their homeland had become a voice over static, fragile, unreachable. Letters arrived through the Red Cross, months delayed, each one a fragment of a vanished Japan. The censors blacked out place names and dates, but emotion leaked through the ink. Mothers wrote of prayer and patience, wives spoke of children now walking, of homes lost in air raids, of courage and waiting. Many letters never came at all. Those who received none began to speak less, eat less, exist less. The camp psychologists, newly appointed by the War Department, kept meticulous records. "Prisoners show evidence of depression upon receipt of homeland news," one report noted. "Recommend increased recreational activity." Baseball games multiplied. More cigarettes were issued. The men smoked with greater urgency now, drawing the smoke deep, as if each breath could fill the distance to their burning cities. That same summer, a shipment of Red Cross parcels arrived containing photographs from Geneva images of Japanese prisoners engaged in farm labor, smiling faintly. The propaganda value was obvious, yet within the camps, the photos served another purpose. They reminded the prisoners that they existed, that they were being seen by the world, that they had not vanished completely. Then came 1945. The snow melted early that year, and the wind carried with it the smell of thawing earth and diesel from passing convoys. Rumors thickened like spring dust. Germany was near defeat. The war in Europe would soon be over. The guards whispered of homecomings, of discharge papers. The Japanese listened from a distance. For them, there would be no homecoming-only release into uncertainty. In May, the camp loudspeakers announced, "Germany has surrendered." The guards cheered. Church bells rang in the nearby town. The Japanese prisoners stood at attention, unmoving. For them, the news was both irrelevant and foreboding. They understood that with Germany's fall, the full weight of Allied power would turn eastward. By midsummer, the newspapers brought a new and incomprehensible word: atomic. The headlines blazed: "Hiroshima destroyed by new bomb." 2 days later, Nagasaki struck. The prisoners gathered in the yard, holding the thin sheets of newsprint as if they might burn through their hands. The interpreters struggled to explain: 1 bomb, 1 plane, 1 city gone. They repeated the numbers. Tens of thousands, perhaps more. The words were too large for belief. For hours, the camp was silent. Smoke rose from the habitual evening cigarettes, but no one spoke. A few men sat on the ground and stared at nothing. Others wept openly for the first time. The guards, uncertain, gave them space. No one knew how to comfort the enemy for the loss of his own people. Days later, the announcement came by radio. Japan accepts unconditional surrender. The war was over. The voice from Washington crackled across every loudspeaker, formal and restrained. The guards removed their helmets. Some prisoners fell to their knees. Others bowed toward the east, murmuring the emperor's name through tears. They were soldiers no more. The camp commandant ordered the flag lowered to half-staff in recognition of the dead on both sides. It was an act that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. The prisoners watched in silence as the stars and stripes descended. The gesture spoke of something beyond victory, perhaps respect, perhaps pity, perhaps the simple exhaustion of war. In the weeks that followed, the camps transformed. Barbed wire remained, but the tension within it dissolved. American guards relaxed their posture, prisoners walked with less caution. Newspapers were translated in full. Pictures of the emperor appeared, his voice, broadcast in surrender, described as soft, almost human. The men wept again, not from shame this time, but from the realization that the God of their fathers was mortal after all. They smoked constantly, now morning, noon, and night. The cigarettes that had once been symbols of defeat became instruments of calm. In the blue haze of tobacco, conversations began to cross languages. Some prisoners traded handmade carvings for extra packs. Others offered origami birds in exchange for matches. The guards obliged, and in those small transactions, peace took shape before any treaty was signed. When the first order of repatriation arrived, the men prepared to leave with a mixture of relief and dread. They were to be shipped home. But what was home now? A landscape of ashes, a family perhaps gone, a nation learning humility. The Americans provided each man with a new uniform, clean boots, and, tucked into the breast pocket, 2 packs of cigarettes. It was both gift and farewell. As the transport trains rolled east toward the coast, smoke trailed from every window. The men leaned out to watch the receding land America, once enemy, now host. The scent of the cigarettes mingled with the coal smoke of the engine. It would be the smell they remembered longest, sharp, foreign, unforgettable. They had entered the camps as warriors of an empire that could not imagine surrender. They left as men who understood both loss and mercy. Between those 2 states lay the thin, curling thread of smoke that had joined their worlds together. The war was over, but peace, as history often proves, does not arrive with the stroke of a pen. It must be carried, endured, lived through mile by mile, man by man. In the autumn of 1945, across the width of America, the trains that had once borne prisoners inland now rolled back toward the sea. Their cargo, men who had fought under the rising sun, who had surrendered to the stars and stripes, and who now traveled toward a homeland they could scarcely imagine. The departure orders came crisp and bureaucratic, printed in English and translated with care. Each man was assigned a number, a destination, a berth aboard the waiting transports. They packed their belongings into canvas duffels, spare clothing, Red Cross blankets, wooden carvings made during long winter nights, a few photographs drawn in charcoal, and in each pocket, without exception, a pack or 2 of American cigarettes. The guards, many of them veterans soon to be discharged, handed them out with the casual generosity of men parting from acquaintances they never thought they would miss. The trains rumbled through plains and valleys, through the same small towns that had once stared at them from afar. Now the faces at crossings waved without malice. Children saluted, Unsure who these passengers were, their uniforms plain, their eyes downcast, some of the prisoners, braver now with words, waved back. America passed by in golden fields and white clapboard houses, unscarred by the bombs that had erased their own cities. They marveled at the stillness, at the endlessness of a land untouched by ruin. At the ports, Seattle, San Francisco, San Pedro camps of departure were established. Here, the final bureaucracy of war turned slowly. Doctors examined each man for signs of illness. Dentists noted decay. Clerks checked names against lists typed months before. It was said that in those weeks no two lists quite agreed. War had scattered records, as it had scattered men. Some were listed as dead who stood living before the officer's desk. Others, still alive somewhere in Asia, were believed lost. The process was mechanical, but beneath the columns and signatures lay an unspoken recognition. Each name restored to the world was a victory of another kind. The Red Cross provided clothing for the voyage gray wool suits, simple and unadorned, and small care parcels containing soap, chocolate, and cigarettes. The latter were always received first. The men lit them at once, inhaling deeply, as though preparing for the unknown with a final breath of America. The smoke curled upward into the chill sea air, mingling with the cry of gulls and the whistle of departing tugs. The ritual persisted. Even now, in the liminal space between captivity and freedom, the cigarette remained the bond between their two worlds. The ships that carried them home were Liberty vessels, the same kind that had once borne tanks and rations to the Pacific front. Now their holds were fitted with bunks and mess halls. American crews manned the decks, quiet and efficient, while the passengers kept to their allotted sections, grateful for the sea breeze and the thought of land ahead. Few spoke loudly. The voyage across the Pacific was both return and reckoning. Days passed in routine. Roll call, meals, the swab of decks, and the long hours of watching the horizon. At night, men gathered in small circles near the railing, smoking beneath the dim safety lights. They spoke softly of home, of cities whose names were now followed by uncertain silence. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Yokohama. Each story ended with the same question: what will remain? The sea offered no answer. It merely rolled, patient and immense, as if erasing the years of hatred in its unending rhythm. The American officers on board treated their charges with formality, tempered by fatigue. The war had taken much from them: two friends, youth, illusions. Many had lost brothers in the Pacific, and now found themselves escorting the very men who had once been their enemies. Yet the proximity of peace softened all edges. On some nights, an officer would offer a cigarette from his own pack. The gesture was accepted with a bow, and silence followed. In that silence lay the faint hum of forgiveness. As the ships neared Japan, the air changed. It smelled of rain and earth, of something remembered. On the morning when the coastline first appeared, a smudge of green and gray against the mist, many of the men wept openly. They crowded the rails, craning for a glimpse of home. But what they saw was not the Japan they had left. The ports were ruins. Warehouses stood roofless, docks splintered, cranes twisted like the bones of giants. American Navy vessels lay at anchor where once had flown the imperial flag. At Uraga, near Yokosuka, the ships anchored. American officers came aboard with Japanese liaison officials, new men of the new government, dressed in Western suits, faces drawn and pale. They carried clipboards and lists, spoke with careful courtesy, and avoided the eyes of those returning. The process of disembarkation was slow and solemn. Each man stepped onto the pier, saluted, and was marked as repatriated. It was a word that suggested restoration, yet few felt restored. The Japanese officials offered brief instructions: transportation inland, registration at local prefectural offices, medical checks. Beyond that, the men were on their own. Many had no homes to return to. Cities lay flattened, families dispersed or gone. The government, under occupation, could promise little beyond rations and ration cards. The prisoners, no, the former prisoners, stood bewildered amid the ruins of their birthland. In the first weeks ashore, many drifted through stations and roads, seeking addresses that no longer existed. They carried small bundles, their meager possessions, and the cigarettes they had saved. It was said that in Tokyo, men who had smoked only in secret during their military service now stood openly in the streets, lighting American brands with trembling hands. The act, once unthinkable, had become commonplace. The cigarette was both symbol and solace, the taste of survival in a world stripped of certainty. Some of the repatriated found work quickly. The occupying forces needed translators, clerks, laborers. Those who had learned English in the camps found themselves suddenly valuable. They spoke the words haltingly, but enough to earn employment as interpreters or assistants. They were paid in dollars, smoked American tobacco, and served under men who had once been their guards. To outsiders, the irony was immense. To the men themselves, it was simply life continuing in unexpected ways. Others withdrew into silence, returning to villages where suspicion and shame awaited. In a society that had exalted death over capture, these men were ghosts in their own land. They avoided questions, avoided mirrors. Yet in private, at night, they would light a cigarette and watch the smoke curl upward, remembering the strange calm of the American camps, the order, the abundance, the faces of enemies who had treated them with dignity. In those moments, the boundary between defeat and peace blurred. Among scholars in later years, much would be written of this quiet transformation, the way captivity abroad had planted seeds of democracy at home, how the treatment of prisoners influenced Japan's post-war ideals of humanity and restraint. But in those first months of repatriation, none of the men thought of history. They thought only of rebuilding, of surviving, of finding warmth in the ruins. Photographs from 1946 show them standing in lines outside ration offices, thin, clean-shaven, wearing surplus American coats. Some smile faintly at the camera, cigarette in hand. The captions read, "Former POWs return home." The eyes tell another story, exhaustion mixed with awakening. The American occupation continued its vast reconstruction effort. Cities were cleared, roads rebuilt, schools reopened. In time, the former prisoners merged into the current of the new Japan. They became shopkeepers, farmers, teachers. Many never spoke of their years behind wire, but when asked, decades later, what they remembered most, the answers came quietly and almost always the same. The smoke, they said, the first American cigarette, the taste of something forbidden that did not kill us. That memory endured longer than the fences, longer than the war itself. It was a small thing, a thin ribbon of smoke rising into the sky of another country, but it marked the moment when enemies began to understand one another as men. In the years that followed the gun's last thunder, time itself became the quietest historian. The barbed wire rusted, the barracks sagged, and wind carried away the dust of forgotten drills. Yet in memories, both American and Japanese, fragments of those camps endured, simple images etched by routine. Morning roll calls, the clatter of mess tins, the faint glow of cigarettes in the evening dusk. By the early 1950s, a new world had taken form. Japan, under occupation, rebuilt with astonishing speed. Factories rose where ashes had lain. School children recited lessons of peace instead of empire. Across the Pacific, America turned its attention to prosperity and to another looming frontier, cold, not hot, yet fraught with the same lessons of vigilance. Between the two nations stretched an ocean no longer hostile, but restless with trade and remembrance. Among the millions who resumed ordinary lives were the men who had once met behind wire. Some never spoke of it again. Others carried faint reminders. The habit of punctuality learned from camp routines, a taste for coffee, the small comfort of an American cigarette. They were unremarkable citizens now, and that very ordinariness was their triumph. In 1954, newsreel crews returned to one of the old Texas compounds. The towers were gone. The prairie grass had swallowed the parade ground. A reporter's voice, steady, nostalgic, narrated the story for audiences who scarcely remembered the tension of that distant war. The film showed Japanese veterans visiting the site, guided by former guards now middle-aged. They stood together before the empty foundations, smiling awkwardly. One of the Americans produced a pack of Lucky Strikes. The camera caught the moment as lighters flared and smoke drifted skyward. The narrator concluded, "Time has a way of turning enemies into neighbors." The reel lasted 2 minutes. The silence that followed in the theater lasted longer. Academics would later call such encounters the human dividend of humane policy. The Geneva Articles, dutifully obeyed, had yielded more than moral credit. They had sown empathy. Former prisoners became interpreters for U.S. advisors, translators for embassies, teachers of language and culture. A few even returned to America as guests, standing once more on soil they had first touched in chains. Interviews recorded their astonishment at the welcome they received. The country had moved on, one said, but it had not forgotten how to forgive. For Americans, too, reflection brought humility. The realization that decency toward captives had helped rebuild an ally strengthened a faith in democratic ideals at a time when new adversaries loomed. Military training manuals of the era cited the Japanese POW program as proof that mercy was not weakness. A generation of officers carried that lesson into Korea and beyond. By the 1960s, the story of Japanese prisoners smoking American cigarettes had faded into anecdote, one small ember among the vast fires of history. Yet those who had witnessed it remembered its meaning. It was not about tobacco or habit, it was about breath itself. In that shared act of inhaling and exhaling, men who had been taught to hate discovered the ordinary rhythm of life unarmed. Half a century later, as veterans aged and reunions dwindled, museums displayed the relics of that improbable fellowship: a dented canteen, a Red Cross Bible, a half-empty cigarette tin stamped U.S. Army, 1944. Visitors looked, some smiled, some wondered how something so small could signify so much. The curator's placard answered in one sentence: "Peace began when the smoke rose, not when the treaty was signed." And so the chronicle ends where it began, in silence, beneath an open sky. The war that once consumed oceans and nations has receded into film grain and fading ink, but the image remains. Men standing together, breath mingling in the cold air, the smoke drifting upward until it disappears into light. They had not been ready for defeat, nor for compassion, nor for the strange mercy of a shared cigarette. Yet from that unready moment came a readiness for peace.